Welcome to the fourth episode of Season 6 of Law Candor, of course, the podcast wholly devoted to pursuing the legal technology revolution. I'm Rob Hellewell, and I'm here with my co-host Bill Mariano, excited to have you with us today. I know you're dying to dive into today's subject, but before we do that, we want to bring you another
Sightings of Radical Brilliance.
And if you listen to the podcast, you know that this is where we talk about the latest or newsworthy innovation or act of sheer genius that catches our eye. So, Bill, what do we have today?
We have an article from Bloomberg Law that I really found interesting. The GDPR and AI, ensuring data protection from the start. This is from Rowan Massey and Claire Sellers of Ropes and Gray wrote this. I love this article. Why? Because we talk about all the time AI. AI is predicated upon having a lot of data, right? The artificial intelligence algorithms mine that data, looking for trends in the data for whatever purpose they're deployed for. And we always, there's a phrase we use all the time, there's something to the word big in big data. The more data, the better. However, there are data privacy issues to be considered when you're doing this. So when companies are using AI to troll all this data and leverage this data to pull, to give insights and trends, is that okay? Is that something is the privacy of the individual something that you have to keep in mind? It's not something that is often addressed.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a lawful basis for these things. And, one of the examples it gives is, facial recognition. There are plenty of great things that you can do with facial recognition that are lawful, that fall within GDPR, but it's so easy to get into that gray area or to actually get out of the gray area and do things that really aren't based on a legitimate interest. And when you have something like AI that is out there, with the ability to pull the strings together, very efficiently and very quickly and gather those different data points and use that to identify people, it gets really sticky, especially when you're talking about, did I agree to have this happen?
I remember you telling me a story when you were getting your master's in this stuff, in analytics, and you said that, when you walk into a Target or a Walmart or a whatever store, the second you walk in, they know whether or not you're pregnant and looking for baby stuff. They know whether or not you're looking to buy, outdoor equipment. They know whether or not you're looking to buy home goods the second you walk in that store because of the data that they have on you when you walk in. And it's interesting, right? I mean, that's obviously AI working to give these companies information about their customers. So it makes sense. They're doing it, they're quote unquote doing it for you. They want to make sure that they point you in the right direction, advertise to you appropriately. But let's face it, they're doing it for them, right? They are leveraging AI to micro target individuals. Instead of just, back in the day when it was putting a television commercial on during Monday Night Football because they knew men between the ages of 18 and 55 were watching it. Now they know what you were watching every second of every day, and they can micro target to you, not on a television commercial, but via your phone. And it's interesting that this is all getting done with information that you've given up at some point, but should that information be being used for these purposes?
Well, and it's funny the words that get used, in trying to create that legitimate interest. It's, well, we're doing this to enhance the customer experience, or, that's great.
No, it's not for profit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. But look, here's the bottom line, and I think the article touches on this. There is a tremendous benefit that can be gained from AI, including what we just discussed, the examples that we just discussed, right? I mean, if you're looking for something and they can advertise it to you and get it to you for a cheaper price, whatever, there's a positive benefit to that. I just think what this article talks about is any organization that's using AI must address the risks of the data subject's privacy rights and their freedoms, right? Because if you don't balance that, that's where you can end up in trouble, because these technologies are very powerful, but they're also leveraging information that has been given over not necessarily for the purpose for which it's being used.
Yep. And again, that line is so easy to cross if companies aren't careful, and the regulators are coming after people, and they're, zero tolerance policies and big fines that we're starting to see. Fascinating topic. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
And now we have the pleasure of bringing one of our favorite people in the world and a great guest, Nick Schreiner of Lighthouse.
Speak for yourself.
I will speak for both of us because I know it's true. And Nick will be here to discuss modern attachment and link challenges that we're seeing in G Suite, Slack, Teams, and other collaboration systems. Stay tuned for a great interview.
Today we have a very, very, very special guest. There are a few people that make me look good throughout my career, personally and professionally. My hairdresser, my makeup artist, and Nick Schreiner. Nick is our client services director at Lighthouse. Rob and I have known him for probably close to 12, 15 years or so. Nick, before we get into topic, I want you to, we ask this of every guest lately, and just because it's really interesting, because this is not something you study in college. How did you get into ediscovery? How did you find yourself to get into this space?
Bill, you did forget to give credit to your psychic too.
Well, and my shrink, but listen, Nick's made me look better than both of those.
Thanks. And gentlemen, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, finally, right? It's season 6 now? I can't tell if you were
stop with the letter petitions. Stop with that whole thing. You're on, okay? You could let it go now.
I couldn't tell if you were waiting for your subscriber base to evaporate before having me on, or if this is when it's peaking. So I'm gonna hope it's the latter. No, honestly, and I'm not just saying this because it's you two, and like you said, we've known each other for over a decade. But this has actually been a lifelong dream of mine. Not ediscovery. I didn't know what that was until 15 years ago. But to do a show like this, and
yeah, I bet.
The story, right, Bill? So the story of how I arrived here on Law Candor today, also a bit of a tale about how I fell into ediscovery. So I will regale you with that. Starts at a young age. My mom, when I was growing up, when I was a young kid, used to tell me that I had a face for radio. And she encouraged me, right? So she encouraged me to work towards a profession where I could just sit in a room away from people, talk about things that were interesting. And so I decided to try and pursue that. She encouraged me throughout my childhood. But I kept hearing while I tried to break into radio that while my face was great for the profession, my voice wasn't quite as good, as I'm sure everyone listening will know by now. So after years of trying to break into the business, I finally gave up and answered an ad for a company that needed help picking up and delivering boxes of legal documents to law firms in Washington, D.C. That turned into delivering the occasional disc with something called concordance load files on it. And from there, a dear friend introduced me to the world of ediscovery project management. That effectively ended our friendship because that world's crazy, but it also is how I met you guys, and the rest is history.
So basically you were qualified for picking up boxes.
Yes.
And now you're here.
I fooled people into thinking that I was qualified for picking up boxes, and now I'm here. So basically, back to present, about 15 minutes from now, I'm going to be able to say I've accomplished a lifelong goal, and then try and figure out what to do with the rest of my life.
Yeah, that's going to be tough. I mean, it's tough to go from the podcast to anything else.
It is. This is the pinnacle.
Well, maybe Nick, just to get us kicked off, we use these terms and sometimes we assume everybody knows what it means, but we're talking about modern attachments and challenges around that. Maybe just start off. What exactly is a modern attachment?
Yeah, good question, Rob. And maybe we'll go back to our present state, our new normal of living in a remote working environment, and talk about the massive pivot to collaboration platforms in general. So platforms like Teams, Slack, Zoom, they've all seen exponential growth thanks to coronavirus. I found an article today that indicated Teams, for example, was around 12 million daily active users around this time last year. That jumped to about 75 million in April. As of last week, that number's grown to 115 million daily users, so almost 10x where they were a year ago. Naturally, when you've got more people using these platforms, they're going to use more of their features. So historically, we've been used to sending most work-related communications via email, though that trend has been shifting, especially in newer organizations over the last few years. Now that we're using platforms like Teams to collaborate with coworkers we may have been used to seeing in person, it's natural we're going to begin sharing content on them as well. And since our document repositories are also now moving to the cloud, into platforms like Microsoft 365, into Google Workplace, the manner in which we access and share content is changing as well. So back to your question, what is a modern attachment? Well, a year or two ago, most of us would probably share a document by attaching it to an email, sending it to somebody that we're collaborating with. That document probably either lived on our laptop or somewhere on our corporate network. Now it likely lives in the cloud, in SharePoint Online, Google Drive, Box, etc. So if we're collaborating in Teams and I want to share a file with you, what I'm actually sending you is a link to that file. The file itself never leaves its original location in SharePoint Online or another cloud-based repository. You can take your choice. And so that's what we mean by modern attachment, right? I'm no longer physically attaching a file and sending it to you. Now I'm really just providing you a link to that file where it exists.
And so is that the main difference from the attachments in tools that are like how they're different from just sending an attachment in traditional email?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I guess we can give an example. So say the three of us are chatting in Teams supporting a project. I share a file with you. Now that's just a link to the file. I'm not actually creating a presentation, say attaching it to an email and sending it to you. So if we're collaborating in Teams, that same presentation exists likely in SharePoint Online. I'm sending you a message saying, hey, Bill, take a look at this. What that is it's you click on it and it takes you to that file in its SharePoint Online location, as opposed to something that you're accessing directly via the email. And so now fast forward to our industry and discovery, right? When we're collaborating and we inevitably do something wrong, we shouldn't, and discovery becomes necessary. Our organization's going to target our communications. They're going to collect our team's communications. When they do this, they're going to be able to grab and review the messages. Within the messages, when they're looking at them, they're going to see that link that I sent you, but no physical documents present. So the messages and the attachments referenced by these links are often stored in different repositories. So for example, with Teams, messages are going to exist in Exchange Online, and the attachments or the links, right, will either exist in SharePoint Online or a user's individual OneDrive. It really depends on the type of chat and how you're communicating, but they exist in separate locations. With Slack, for example, attachments can actually be physically associated with a message, but also if I'm communicating, I can simply drop a link to a file that exists in Box or Dropbox or some other repository location into a message. So when we do the collection, when we're presented with this data, obviously not having the message and the attachment together, like we're used to seeing in email, presents all kinds of challenges related to collection, downstream processing, review, production, and beyond, really.
And Nick, with this shift to modern attachments, I'm sure there's a lot of clients that are struggling with this. Any war stories you can share, or what kind of advice are you giving clients?
Yeah, well, on the advice front, I would say that it all starts, as most things do, with effective data mapping. So understanding where messages and documents exist in the first place. Beyond the capability of identifying where these exist, you have to have a mechanism for collecting these repositories. Identification and collection capabilities may also depend on the type of licensing that you have, so you've got to be aware of that. For example, if you're a Microsoft customer and you have an E3 level license, you have different capabilities for identifying and collecting Teams-related data sources than you do if you're at an E5 level. If you're a Slack customer and if you have Enterprise Grid, you have more capability than those that are running or operating on lower licensing tiers. So, understanding where your content lives and then what your capabilities are for going and grabbing it is going to be first and foremost. In terms of challenges, right? So beyond just identification and collection, the next one exists downstream during processing and review. Because modern attachments aren't physically associated with their messages, we have to be able to identify the messages that reference these links and then map those messages to the files that were shared. There are currently different capabilities for doing this, depending on the data sources and what we're able to access at that point of collection. For example, and you asked about war stories, like when we support projects involving high volumes of Teams data, starting at the point of collection, we'll recommend collecting all versions of SharePoint Online when you go through that collection through Microsoft 365. And just to walk it back to that scenario where we're collaborating, say I create a presentation, I email it to Bill, I ask Bill to make edits, Bill does that, he saves a version, sends it to you, Rob, asks you to make final edits, you do that, and then save the final version. If we're collecting our email in that sort of dynamic, what you get are the email messages, and then you get each of those versions that I attached, that Bill attached, and then Rob attached, which makes it pretty simple and straightforward for review and production purposes. In our cloud-based world, if we're just sharing links to a file, ease of reference for us, I say, hey, Bill, check out this link, make adjustments to it. Bill does that. And then he shares that link to Rob. Rob, you make your adjustments. That file exists in SharePoint. If we go and simply collect SharePoint as it exists today, what we're going to get is Rob's final version of that file. When we go to look at the messages downstream, we're going to be able to find that final version of the file. What we're not going to have is the version that I created and shared, the version that Bill modified and shared, unless we grab versions when we collect SharePoint. By grabbing the versions, we're able to identify the version of a document that was shared at a point in time the message was sent and effectively stitch those back together.
That makes sense, except that Bill never lets me make the final edits on a document. So
Ever. I always have to get the last word, even if it's written. So it's almost like they developed these tools for the betterment of business without e-discovery in mind. Go figure. But seriously, if these tools are not developed with e-discovery in mind, right? That's the issue. Now we have to deal with it. The legal departments have to deal with it, but that's not why they're developed. Obviously, they're developed for the betterment of business, for doing business every day. And then e-discovery and technology in the e-discovery industry has to adapt. So what strategies and what technologies would you put in place if you're running your e-discovery program to handle these things? So, and I know you touched on a couple of best practices, but are there tools out there? Do you go outside your organization for consulting services? What do you have to keep in mind, knowing full well that this is just it's going to get more and more prevalent? And again, they just are not. They sometimes, Microsoft, for instance, will go back and adapt to make it a little bit more e-discovery friendly. But that's not the intention of these tools, to be e-discovery friendly. So, what have you learned about this, and what sort of information can you give our audience around strategies?
Right, and I think to your first point, definitely not developed with e-discovery in mind. I think there's even an interesting question that some of the developers might even ask, and that's, are these documents that are being shared, should they be considered attachments, right? Because it's simply a link to a file that exists somewhere else, very different than how we've come to know and love our emails and attachments. To your questions about technical solutions that are available, it really depends on how you're set up, what collaboration platforms you're using, where your document repositories are, and what they are. And so let's take Slack, for instance. You've got, depending upon your license level, you can either do a simple and straightforward JSON export, or if you're at enterprise grid, there are third-party applications out there that can collect both messages and attachments, facilitate that link like we're used to in a more standard setting. Like I mentioned with Teams, and being able to reference files that were shared in the Microsoft ecosystem, or really any of the modern attachments, you have to have the ability downstream during processing to identify messages where attachments were associated. And number two, you have to be able to identify, assuming that you've collected it, where those attachments exist as they came from a different repository. Then you have to have the capability of stitching the two to create a document family like we're used to seeing with email and attachments. So absent that capability to, number one, identify messages that have a link or reference a modern attachment. Number two, to identify those modern attachments within your collected population. Number three, to stitch those together like a traditional family. Your ability to both review incomplete family and produce incomplete family is going to be impacted.
This is fascinating, Nick. I think for a lot of our audience, they're just kind of getting into this world of modern attachments, and if they're lucky, they haven't had to go out and try to collect them yet. But maybe just to sum up a little bit, modern attachments, different than the traditional attachments that we've been used to. These links might exist in different places, but are typically going to be somewhere in the cloud versus sitting on a hard drive. And adapting to this really requires a different strategy around how you identify these and how you collect them. I thought the advice that you gave was great, that it really takes a true understanding of not just the platforms that people are using, but how documents are specifically being stored there, and that each platform might have a different way of storing those and trying to locate those. And even if you're lucky enough to understand the platforms, find out where these links and modern attachments exist, you still have to stitch them together at the end. And this is a pretty complex process. definitely adds a layer of complexity over what we've seen in the traditional attachment world. And I just think this has been a great introduction for a lot of us into how this works, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, and Nick, the part of the program here is when our clients need help and they want best practice and they want to know what happens, we're going to give out your personal phone number, if that's cool, on the podcast, on the link. And we're going to tell people you especially like to be called on Sundays. And then we're going to give your wife's number as well, so that if you can't field the call, Bri can field the call in case our clients need anything. That's cool.
Good to have a backup.
Of course. And before you made that point, I was going to thank Rob for telling me that it was great advice. That's actually the first time I've ever heard that. So for potential clients and customers that would want to call me directly, just know that.
Just know that that's the first time you've ever given good advice.
But now it's official.
Yeah, there you go.
And I'll take it.
Yeah, and I wrote it down, which makes it real. Okay, and I'm going to put it on the internet, and everyone trusts everything on the internet. Nick gives good advice is now on the internet. You can Google it, and now that's real because everything on the internet is real, just like Abraham Lincoln said. All right, Nicholas, thank you for joining us. Get smarter every time I talk to you, and lucky for me, I talk to you twice a day. Thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it. Great having you on. Finally, you're going to get a Law Candor t-shirt. We're going to give it to you in 2 sizes too small, so your arms look huge.
Yeah.
That's how I order them. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Man. If you are a fan of this podcast, you have to let us know. Subscribe. Smash the subscribe button. Punch the subscribe button. Kick your phone until you subscribe 3 or 4 times. Call a friend. You know, they say make a plan to vote. Take a friend to the booth. Make a friend subscribe. Why? Because otherwise our producer will fire us. There are other people here at the company that can do this stuff. We're not the only 2 people that can do this. I mean, we think we are, but we're not. They're going to get rid of us unless you subscribe. Do it, please. Please, subscribe, resubscribe, unsubscribe, resubscribe, smash that button. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.